Oh my god, hi! I didn't see you there. I was just studying for a really big exam that I have coming up. My name is Miranda. I am a fourth year at SUNY ESF. I'm an environmental studies major with a focus on policy, and today we are going to be talking about Miranda v. Arizona and how this landmark case defined your rights in the Constitution. Before I tell you more, let's talk about some context. If you like old movies, you've probably heard the expression, giving them the third degree. Little did you know, this expression is actually very real and was used when those who were interrogating suspects were very unusually cruel and often verbally abusive to those they were interrogating. And more often than not, in the 1960s, this method was used against African Americans. The voluntariness test was used at the time, and it essentially gave judges complete discretion to assess whether or not police had used an appropriate level of force and if they were verbally abusive towards those that they were bringing into custody. Courts evaluated voluntariness by looking at the totality of the circumstances, which means that these judges would take into account a suspect's education level, their financial status, whether they had any physical or mental health issues, and they would use this to decide whether or not the police had used an appropriate amount of force and that the suspect was apprehended accordingly. Naturally, this put a huge caseload on judges and was a cesspool for things like personal morals and ethics and conflicts of interest. It exposed the judicial process to things like corruption. Now let's talk about Miranda. Miranda was arrested for the rape and kidnap of an 18-year-old girl who is referred to as Patricia in this case. He was apprehended at a time when the judicial process was on the precipice of change. It was the 1960s, and tensions were already high within a lot of the state courts as well as the federal courts. The courts needed to find a way to make sure that confessions weren't coerced. In a lineup, Patricia wasn't sure that Miranda was the assailant, but afterwards, the cops had told Miranda that he had been identified, thus getting a confession from Miranda that he had committed the crime. Miranda appealed the case at first to the state of Arizona and then eventually to the Supreme Court of the United States. How could his confession be voluntary and in good faith when he wasn't even aware of the rights that he had? Initial concern was the violation of his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, whether he made a knowing and intelligent waiver of his rights. Let's remember that Ernesto Miranda was eventually found guilty for this crime. And while not the most sympathetic defendant, it brings up a bigger question of constitutionality and knowing your rights in the United States. So, what happened in court? Miranda's lawyer initially tried to argue that there was a Sixth Amendment violation, where because Miranda was questioned without the presence of a lawyer, that he had waived his right to counsel. The Supreme Court rejected the Sixth Amendment violation argument and instead opted for the Fifth Amendment violation argument. As they felt it was time for a procedural reform, there needed to be certain warnings given to Miranda in order for his confession to even be admissible in court. The state was represented by Telford Taylor, who initially wanted to keep the totality of the circumstances. He thought that this method allowed for courts to take into account the nuances of each individual case, in order to ensure that confessions would be truly voluntary. He felt that the procedural reform that the Supreme Court wanted would ultimately be too rigid, and these circumstances would cause adverse behavior in people that were suspected of crimes. Considering the totality of circumstances would be far better than just applying a checklist to suspects that were to be interrogated. This eventually would lead to the disposal of the totality of circumstances, as Justice Hugo Black even labeled them as being too subjective. Miranda had assumed that he would be released because his confession was not admissible in court, meaning they couldn't really use it against him because he wasn't expressed his rights. However, unfortunately, he had threatened his common-law wife, who had then gone to the police herself and reported Miranda, saying that he confessed the crimes to her. Because this was a citizen report, separate from a police interrogation, Miranda was then retried for the crime in the light of new evidence and was therefore apprehended and sentenced. So how does this affect you? Not only do you need to have your Miranda rights explained to you, but you also need to be explicitly told that you are within your rights and are entitled to waive them if you so desire. There are some exceptions to Miranda. An exception to Miranda would be if a suspect is not in custody or if a suspect voluntarily comes down to the police station. There can also be things such as extraordinary circumstances where police have to apprehend, let's say, a terrorist, where the threat to public safety is so great that they can forgo this process. Miranda established a custodial and procedural way to treat suspects in order to get a confession from them and also to let them know that they have rights that they are entitled to. Rights against self-incrimination, right to counsel, they are explicitly stated within the Miranda rights. When you deny your Miranda rights, you must explicitly say on record that you are willingly waiving your rights. Miranda v. Arizona fundamentally changed the way that the police system operates, as well as the courts. It reinforced the rights that individuals had during police interrogation. This landmark decision upholds your right as an individual to give confessions or not give confessions at your discretion. This is outlined in the due process principle of the Constitution. Miranda remains as a cornerstone of American legal protections. Justice must always be balanced with fairness and respect to each suspect or defendant. I'm a police officer. I'm the police. Come here, I'm gonna handcuff you. Click, click. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of the law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights, what I have just read to you?
Yes.
She's in for murder. Did you do it?
I'm not talking. I remember my Miranda rights. I plead the fifth.